All right, guys, we're on chapter 5 of Thomas Mann, Death in Venice. So this is the last chapter. It's definitely going to take me for sure about, I don't know, it's going to take me a little minute. Chapter 5, Thomas Mann. It's going to maybe take me 2 or 3 parts, but we're going to read about 20 minutes. So during the 4th week of his sojourn on the Lido, Gustav von Aschenbach detected several eerie things in the world around him. First of all, it struck him that while the season was advancing, the number of guests at his hotel was going down rather than up. He felt especially that the German language here was waning and fading out, so that only foreign sounds reached his ears at meals and on the beach. Then one day, while conversing with the hotel barber whom he now visited frequently, he heard something rather startling. The man had mentioned a German family that had just left after a brief visit, and he added in a chatty and flattering tone, "You're staying on, Signor. You're not scared of the illness?" Aschenbach looked at him. "Illness?" he echoed. The prattler held his tongue, acted busy, ignored the question, and when the customer persisted, the barber said he knew nothing, and with an embarrassed babbling, he quickly tried to change the subject. That was around noon. After lunch, in a dead calm and under a broiling sun, Aschenbach boarded a gondola to Venice, for he was driven by a mania to follow the Polish siblings who, with their chaperone, had set out for the steamer dock. He did not find his idol on Piazza San Marco, but when Aschenbach was having his tea at a small, round iron table on the shady half of the square, he suddenly noticed a peculiar smell in the air, an aroma that he now felt he had been inhaling for days without realizing it, a cloying medicinal odor reminiscent of poverty and injury and dubious hygiene. He sniffed it, and after Moline recognized it, he finished his snack and left the square on the side across from the cathedral. In the cramped alleys, the stench grew stronger. At corners, the city fathers had stuck up printed announcements to inform the inhabitants about certain gastric disorders common in this kind of weather, and to warn against the consumption of clams and oysters as well as canal water. These signs were obviously meant to gloss over an unpleasant situation. Groups of people clustered silently on the squares and bridges, and the stranger stood among them, probing and pondering. A shopkeeper was leaning in his doorway among coral necklaces and imitation amethyst trinkets, and Aschenbach asked him about the obnoxious odor. The man scrutinized him with heavy eyes and hastily livened up. "A protective measure, Signor," he replied, gesticulating. "A police injunction that we can only approve of. This weather is oppressive. A sirocco is not conducive to good health. In short, you understand, a perhaps exaggerated precaution." Aschenbach thanked him and walked on, and even on the steamer carrying him back to the Lido, he now caught the smell of the Germicide. Upon re-entering the hotel, he headed straight for the periodicals table in the lobby and leafed through the various gazettes. He found nothing in the non-German ones. The German papers mentioned rumors, cited fluctuating figures, reported official denials, and doubted the veracity. Let me pause right here real quick. Uh, so periodicals. I don't know, I like that word. That explained the departure of the German and Austrian contingents. Other nationals evidently knew nothing, sensed nothing, were not nervous as yet. "They're trying to keep quiet," thought Aschenbach, indignantly tossing the newspapers back on the table. "They're trying to keep it quiet," but at the same time he was happy about the adventure awaiting the world around him. For the established order and well-being of normal life run counter not only to crime, but also to passion, which welcomes and vaguely hopes to benefit from any loosening of the bourgeois fabric, any confusion and affliction in the world. So Waschenbach felt a dark satisfaction about what was happening in the filthy alleys of Venice, about the official cover-up in the city's nasty secret, a secret that blended with his own most private secret, and that he too was intent on guarding. For the lover had only one anxiety, that Taggio might leave Venice, and Aschenbach realized, not without dismay, that he would not know how to go on living if that occurred. But now he was no longer content to rely on the daily routine or on chance in order to see and be near the beauty. He followed him, he tracked them down. On Sundays, for instance, the Poles never showed up at the beach. He figured out that they were attending Mass at San Marco. He hurried over, and passing from the torrid square into the golden twilight of the sanctuary, he found the youngster he had been deprived of. He was bowing over a prie-dieu, I don't know, some fucking French word. Aschenbach then stood in the back on the fissured mosaic floor amid worshippers who were kneeling, murmuring, crossing themselves in the crowded splendor of this oriental temple weighed lusciously on his senses. In front, the heavily adorned in front, the heavily adorned priest was moving, gesturing, and singing. Incense was billowing up, shrouding the mall. Limp flames of the altar candles and the mawkish and mind-dulling sacrificial fragrance seemed to be mingling with the lesser smell, the odor of the sickened city. But through haze and sparkle, Aschenbach saw the beauty turn his head, look for him, and sight him. When the populace then streamed out through the open portals and gathered in the lustrous square, which was teeming with pigeons, the infatuated fool hid in the vestibule. He lurked, he lay in wait, he saw the Poles leaving the church, saw the children ceremoniously saying goodbye to the mother, who now headed back to the Piazzetta. He determined that the beauty, these nun-like sisters and the governess turned right, walked through the clock tower gates and into the Mercedia, and after giving them a head start, he followed them stealthily on their promenade through Venice. He had to halt whenever they lingered. He had to flee into restaurants and courtyards whenever they doubled back. He lost them, hunted them, feverish and fatigued, across bridges and through dirty dead ends. And he endured minutes of lethal anguish when he suddenly saw them coming toward him through a narrow passage from which there was no escape. Nevertheless, one cannot say that he suffered. His head and heart were intoxicated, and his steps obeyed the instructions of the demon who delights in trampling on human reason and dignity. Taggio and the others then boarded a gondola somewhere, while Aschenbach watched from behind a portico or fountain. Next, after they pushed off, he likewise got into a gondola. Muttering hastily, he pointed to the one just rounding that corner there, and he promised the oarsman a handsome gratuity if he trailed it inconspicuously at a certain distance, and he shuddered when the man, with the roguish helplessness, no, with the roguish helpfulness of a panderer, assured him in the same tone of voice that he would be taken care of, conscientiously taken care of. And so, leaning on soft black cushions, he swayed and glided along in the wake of the other black beat craft to which he was fettered by passion. Sometimes the quarry eluded him. He would then feel anguish and disquiet. But as if well practiced in such affairs, his boatmen, by maneuvering slyly, by shooting crisscross and taking shortcuts, always managed to sight the coveted object again. The air was still and smelly, the sun burned heavily through the haze that turned the sky the color of slate. Gurgling water slapped against wood and stone. Thanks to some bizarre convention, the gondolier's cry, half warning, half greeting, was answered from deep within the hush of the labyrinth. From small, high-lying gardens, white and purple blossoms with an almond scent were dangling over crumbling walls. Moorish window frames stood out in the dreary light. The marble steps of a church descended into the canal. A beggar, squatting there proclaiming his poverty, held out his hand and shadowed the whites of his eyes as if he were blind. An antique dealer outside his dumpy booth groveled before the passenger, inviting him to stop off, hoping to bilk him. That was Venice, the cajoling and dubious beauty, the city, half fairy tale, half tourist trap, where art had once voluptuously run riot in the putrid air, and which gave musicians sounds that lulled and lolloped lasciviously, the adventurer felt as if his eyes were drinking in this voluptuousness, as if his ears were being wooed by such melodies. He also recalled that the city was ill, but concealing its illness out of greed, and he peered more wantonly after the gondola floating ahead of him. The city was ill, but concealing its illness out of greed. All that he confused, all that the confused man knew and desired was to keep ceaselessly pursuing the object that inflamed him, to dream about him in his absence, and, as lovers do, speak tenderly to his mere phantom. Loneliness, foreignness, and the happiness of a profound and belated intoxication encouraged him and persuaded him to experience the most astonishing things, freely and without blushing. Thus, one night, returning from Venice, he had halted on the second floor of the hotel at the beauty's door. Utterly exhilarated, he had pressed his forehead against the hinge for a long time, unable to tear himself away, running the risk of being caught and snared in such an insane action. But still there were moments when he paused, half regaining his sense. What am I doing? He would think in bewilderment. What am I doing? As with any man whose native merits arouse an aristocratic interest in his ancestry, his achievements and successes always inspired him to recall his forebears, to assure himself mentally of their approval, their satisfaction, their mandatory respect. He thought of them here and now, entangled as he was in such an illicit experience, involved in such exotic emotional debauchery. He remembered their rigorous self-control, their respectable manliness, and he smiled dourly. What would they say? But then again, what would they have said about his entire life, which deviated from theirs to the point of degeneracy? What would they have said about his life lived under the sway of art? Once, with the bourgeois attitude of his forefathers, the adolescent had openly derided such an existence, which basically was so similar to theirs. He too had served in the military, had been a soldier and warrior like a number of them. For art was a war, a grueling struggle that nowadays ground you down very quickly. A life of defiance and strength of mind, a stern, staunch, and abstemious life that he had shaped into a symbol of the frail heroism that fitted in with the times. He had the right to call that life manly, to call it valiant, and it seemed to him as if the kind of eros that had overpowered him somehow fitted in with and favored such a life. Had not this Eros been highly revered by the bravest nations? Had it not, it was said, flourished in their cities because of bravery? Countless ancient war heroes had willingly borne its yoke, never viewing its commands as humiliations, and those heroes did things that would be condemned as cowardice if done for any other reasons. They knelt, vowed, begged, and slavishly groveled, and such actions never shamed the lover. Why, he even reaped praise for them. Those thoughts controlled Aschenbach's infatuated mind. They propped him up, they preserved his dignity, but at the same time he kept stubbornly focusing on and investigating the shady events inside Venice, that adventure of the surrounding world, the adventure that darkly merged with his, nourishing his passion with vague, lawless hopes. Obsessed with attaining reliable news about the status and progress of the disease, he went to the city's cafes and plowed through all the German newspapers which had been missing from the hotel lobby during the past few days. Assertions alternated with retractions. The overall tally of patients, the number of deaths supposedly ran to 20, to 40, nay, 100 and more. Yet right after that, any occurrence of the epidemic was, if not roundly denied, at least waved off as sporadic, blamed on a few isolated cases among foreign tourists. Next came earnest warnings as well as protests against the dangerous game being played by the Italian authorities, but no certainty was to be had. Nevertheless, the solitary man felt he had a special claim to be let in on the street, and though excluded, he found a bizarre satisfaction in approaching the insiders and those who were allied in silence. By asking them embarrassing questions, he forced them to tell outright lies. One day during lunch in the main dining room, he confronted the hotel manager, that short man in the French frock coat, who was walking softly among the guests, greeting them and supervising. When he paused at Aschenbach's small table to exchange a few inconsequential words, the guest asked casually, almost in passing, why in the world they had been disinfecting Venice for some time now. It's a police measure, the pussyfooter replied. the pussyfoot. It's a police measure, the pussyfooter replied. They are doing their duty in forestalling all kinds of unwholesome disturbances or disruptions that might assail the public health due to this unreasonably hot and stifling weather. The police deserve our praises, Aschenbach rejoined, and after a brief give and take of meteorological remarks, the manager excused himself. That evening after dinner, it so happened that a small troop of buskers from the city were performing in the front garden of the hotel. They stood, 2 men and 2 women, by the iron post of an arc lamp, and their faces, whitened by the glow, were turned up toward the large terrace where the guests, over their coffee and cooling drinks, were patronizing the folksy entertainment. The hotel personnel, bellhops, waiters, and office clerks were listening from the lobby doorways. The members of the Russian family, eager and precise in their enjoyment, had their wicker chairs moved down into the garden closer to the musicians, and they sat there gratefully in a half circle. Behind the mother stood her old serf in her turban-like headgear. A mandolin, a guitar, a concertina, and a squilling fiddle were being strummed, scraped, or squeezed by the beggar virtuosi, virtuosi. Instrumental presentations alternated with vocal numbers, in which the younger woman, with her raspy, squawky voice, joined the sweetly falsettoing tenor in a yearning love duet. But the truly talented star and leader of the group proved incontestably to be the other man, a guitarist and a sort of baritone buffo, with no voice to speak of, but with a gift for mimicry and with a remarkable comedic energy. Often with his instrument on his arm, he would detach himself from the group and burlesque his way to the bottom of the terrace, the footlights, where his antics were rewarded with buoyant laughter. The Russians in their front row seats were particularly ecstatic about so much southern agility, and their clapping and cheering kept encouraging him to get bolder and brasher. Aschenbach sat at the balustrade, occasionally cooling his lips with a blend of pomegranate juice and soda water, which sparkled ruby red in the glass. His nerves greedily lapped up the suffering sounds of vulgar and languishing tunes, for passion paralyzes all sense of choosiness and succumbs quite earnestly to that which sobriety would take as a joke or reject indignantly. As he watched the prancing buffoon, Aschenbach's features froze into a painfully twisted grin. He sat there nonchalantly, but his mind was tense and totally absorbed in something else, for just 6 paces away from him, Taggio was leaning on the stone barrier. He had on the white belted suit that he sometimes wore at dinner, and he stood there showing innate and inevitable grace, his lower left arm on the balustrade, his feet crossed, his right hand on his supporting hip. He looked down at the ballad mongers with an expression that was not so much a smile as an aloof curiosity, a cordial acknowledgement. At times he would straighten up, toss out his chest, and with a lovely movement of both arms, he would draw his white jacket down through his leather belt. And at other times, as the aging man noted in triumph and dismay, with thrilling senses, Taggio would turn his head, and with cautious hesitancy or with sudden haste, as if to catch the lover off guard, he would peek at him over his left shoulder. Their eyes did not meet, for a mortifying uneasiness compelled the aberrant man to keep an anxious rein on his glances. The women in charge of Taggio were sitting at the rear of the terrace, and matters had reached such a pass that the lover dreaded being conspicuous and arousing suspicion. Indeed, a few times on the beach, in the hotel lobby, and on Piazza di San Marco, Aschenbach had noticed with a kind of numbness that they had called Taggio back when he was near him. They were intent on keeping the boy away from him, and Aschenbach had been terribly offended. His pride had suffered unknown tortures which his conscience had prevented him from forswearing. Meanwhile, the guitarist accompanying himself had launched into a solo ditty, a smash hit throughout Italy, and while his entire group joined in with each refrain, singing and playing all their instruments, he devoted his full dramatic verve to delivering the many stanzas. With a slight build and gaunt, emaciated face, he stood there on the gravel, separated from his companions, a shabby felt hat on the back of his head, a shock of his red hair swelling out from under the brim. With swaggering bravura, he twanged his guitar and belted out his parlando, hurling his banter up the terrace so that his strenuous efforts made the veins bulge on his forehead. He did not look like the Venetian type. He seemed to belong to the race of the Neapolitan comedians. Half pimp, half actor, brutal and insolent, dangerous and entertaining. His lyrics were merely silly, but because of his expressions, his body movements, his leers, and the way his tongue played lasciviously in the corner of his mouth, the song became suggestive on his lips, vaguely vaguely scurrilous. From the soft collar of his sports shirt, which he wore with a more normal suit, his scraggy neck loomed up with a strikingly huge and naked-looking Adam's apple. There was no telling his age from his pale, stub-nosed, beardless face, which seemed thoroughly rumpled from grimaces and vices, and the two defiant, imperious, almost savage furrows between his reddish brows contrasted oddly with the grin on his mobile mouth. But what made the solitary traveler scrutinize a musician so thoroughly was that the suspicious figure appeared to bring along his own suspicious emanation. For at each refrain, the singer, twisting his features and shaking his hands, set off on a grotesque circular march, which took him directly beneath Aschenbach. And whenever this happened, the powerful stench of carbolic acid billowed up to the terrace from his clothes, his body. All right, guys, we're just going to stop right there. I don't know how many more pages I have for this chapter, but we're at 20 minutes now, so I'm just waiting. I don't know what's going to happen. I think he's going to die from this this foul odor that's going around Venice. I'm not sure. I don't know. We have about 12 pages left, so it might be one more part or another 2 parts. So just want to get that. Just want to get it done already.